Welcome fourth graders to another video cast. Damn, my head's getting cut off a little bit. But we are going to be reviewing landforms. Okay, so hopefully you have your notebooks out and you're paying attention. Alright? Now we've been covering a lot lately about rocks and minerals, the rock cycle, and weathering and erosion. So hopefully this is one of the last lessons that we're going to have talking about the Earth. Alright? Anyways, okay, the different kinds of landforms. Okay, we have ice sheets or glaciers, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more about that later. We have montañas or mountains. We have valleys and canyons. We have rivers. Valleys we already talked about. We have plains. And we have sand dunes. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about each one of these. Okay, first of all, how do ice sheets kind of transform our land? Well, these massive glaciers a long time ago are huge, massive blocks of ice. Okay, and what happens is they start moving along these huge things of ice. Now, underneath the ice, it's scraping the ground. It's pulling up massive boulders and rocks and plants and everything else. So the big ice sheet is coming along and it's scraping the ground, okay? Now, if there's anything in front of the glacier or underneath, once again, it's like a bulldozer and it's pushing it and grabbing it and scraping underneath the ground. And eventually, though, because underneath the glacier, or maybe even in front of the glacier, there becomes so much stuff that the glacier can't push anymore, and it stops. Okay? And what happens is when it stops, it creates like a U-shaped landform. Okay? Mountains build up on the other side of the U because you can picture the glacier come up, it's pushing, and then it stops. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of mountains on the other side of the glacier. Okay? The glacier then melts, it goes away, and then you're going to have a big U-shaped bowl valley that developed into the landform. And you can see a really good picture of that in your book on page 222. Alright, so go ahead and check that out if you need a little visual picture. Alright? So that's how glaciers or ice sheets change our land. They can create little U-shaped valleys. Okay? Mountains. Okay, mountains. Basically what happens here is you have a cloud, the rain comes down, and it lands on top of the mountain. Now high up in the mountains, streams start to form. Streams are rivers that are streams are channels of water that are about that wide apart. Okay, so the stream goes along, it's not very wide, and there's a whole bunch of them all over the top of the mountain. Now eventually, though, those streams are going to join together and make a big river. And hopefully you can see that in your notes. The streams are up top, and eventually they come together and join into a big river. Okay? Now after a while, the river can start carving into the ground. Okay? You can picture it's constantly running. And remember, water is made up of tiny little things called atoms. And atoms are actually things that you could touch if you were small enough. So underneath there's like a whole bunch of tiny little metal beads, okay, or marbles, and they're constantly scraping the bottom of the river where the ground is at. Okay? So eventually, once the river keeps scraping away at the bottom, it's going to make a valley. Now a valley is a real shallow, let's say the river is coming this way. A valley is just a real shallow dip in the land. Okay? Whereas in a canyon is a real steep cut in the Earth's surface. Okay? So that's pretty much it. So the rivers come along, they make little valleys, or they make canyons with really steep sides. Making these valleys and making these canyons take a really long time. It takes a while to carve these valleys and these steep canyons into the land. Things that happen a little bit quicker that weather the surface of our land is mudslides. Basically what happens is, towards the bottom of the mountain, there's a whole bunch of sand and sediments, and when it's raining, the sand turns into mud, okay? And if the sand gets heavy enough, it can break off from the mountain and it goes rushing down, okay? So if you have a whole bunch of people that like to live near the base of a mountain, it can be really dangerous because all of a sudden the mudslide can get released and it can take out a lot of homes. But these happens really fast. The mudslides can flow as fast as a river. Okay, and so this changes our landscape really fast in comparison to canyons and valleys. Moving on to some other different types of landforms, we have plains. Plains are long stretches of land that do not have hills or mountains. Then another type of landform are sand dunes, and there is a picture of sand dunes in your science book on page 220 and 221. Basically what happens is the wind kind of pushes up on the sand and it makes little dunes, right? So we got plains, sand dunes. Continuing on a little bit with our conversation about the rivers. At the very beginning of the river, it's called the mouth of a river. The river is carrying a whole bunch of sediments, right? And the sediments are getting carried along by the water, and sometimes the sediments get stuck. Maybe there is a rock at the bottom of the river, and so a sediment is coming along, and it hits that rock. Well then, once that sediment stops up against the rock, other sediments come along and crash into the rock and the sediments. And then more sediments come along and get stuck. More sediments. And eventually what happens is you have like these little mini islands called deltas. And it's basically just a whole bunch of sediments that are stuck. Okay? Sediments that deposits at the mouth of rivers are called deltas. Once again, deltas are sediments that deposit at the mouth of rivers. Thinking along the same lines of sediments that get stuck, you have these things called barrier islands. The ocean carries a whole bunch of sediments, and for whatever reason, maybe there's coral reef, or maybe there are rocks along the coastline, sediments start to get stuck. And when more and more sediments start to get stuck, it makes it all the more easier for other sediments to get stuck. What eventually happens is you kind of have this island that goes along the coast, and these are called barrier islands. Let's look at rocky cliffs and how waves can erode or weather rocky cliffs. So, and there is a picture of these rocky cliffs on page 218 in your science book. And what happens is these rocky cliffs kind of stick out along the coastline. The waves come along and they crash into the sides of the Rocky Mountains. And because the water is made up of the little atoms, they kind of they crash into the side of the rocky cliffs and they can break off. Eventually, the waves keep pounding into the rocky cliffs. They can wipe them away completely. Okay. And that's what it says in your textbook. There's a big picture of a rocky cliff. It says in your book that eventually the ocean will wipe that entire rocky cliff out of there because the waves will keep pounding. And lastly, you have these weird rock sculptures that can form because of the way the wind weathers the land. Okay? Remember, the wind has little bits of dirt in it. So when the wind is flowing, it acts like sandpaper. Okay, just like the water, it can scrape or chisel away at the land. So the wind comes along and it's scraping away at this rock this way. The wind comes along and it scrapes around the rock. The wind comes along and it scrapes up on the rock. And what happens after a while, it's kind of weird, but these rock sculptures start to form because of how the wind is weathering around it. I believe that is about it. We've covered most of everything. Hope you guys do well on the test review. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions on Edmodo. Facebook, or you can hit me up on my Celly Telly by going to my classroom website and clicking the Contact Mr. P button. Thank you for listening and watching.